Over the last couple of decades, Venezuela took over more than 1,000 private companies, and a whole lot of them were American. This move kicked off one of the biggest political and legal showdowns in recent memory. So, let's get right into it. What exactly did Venezuela take from U.S. corporations, and what was the big idea behind this massive wave of nationalizations? To really get a handle on the stakes here, you just have to look at this number. We're talking over $20 billion. That's how much Venezuela now owes from international court rulings, most to the companies whose assets it seized. It's an absolutely staggering amount of money that the country just had no way to pay. So this really gets to the heart of our explainer today. How on earth did we get here? How did a country that's literally floating on oil end up with a multi-billion-dollar IOU and on the verge of losing its most valuable foreign asset? Well, the answer is a story about revolution, nationalism, and ultimately, economic collapse. Okay, first things first, let's look at the fallout. After their assets were seized, these U.S. corporations didn't just pack up and go home. Oh no. They took Venezuela to court, and that's what sparked this massive, globe-spanning legal war. And what's just wild when you look at this is the sheer size of these legal wins for the American companies. I mean, look at ConocoPhillips. They were awarded over $11 billion for their seized oil projects alone. ExxonMobil, OI Glass, Koch Industries, they all won huge awards too. These weren't just slaps on the wrist. These were knockout financial blows. So, with Venezuela completely unable to pay these massive debts, the creditors got creative. They went after the country's most valuable asset outside its borders, what everyone called its jewel in the crown, Citgo Petroleum. That's the huge refining company based right in Houston, Texas, but owned by Venezuela's state oil company. And you might be asking, how is that even possible? Well, the courts use this really interesting legal tool called the alter ego doctrine. They basically said, look, the Venezuelan government and its state oil company, PDVSA, are essentially the same entity. They're one and the same. And that decision was huge because it allowed creditors of the country to go after the company's assets, specifically Citgo, which is now on the auction block to pay off all these debts. Okay, so that's the result. That's the legal and financial mess. But to understand the why, well, for that, we have to rewind the clock. We've got to go back to the election of Hugo Chávez and the start of his Bolivarian revolution. Venezuela's relationship with its oil is, let's say, complicated. Way back in 1929, it was the world's #2 producer, but foreign companies called all the shots. Now, there was an earlier attempt at nationalization in 1976, but when Hugo Chávez got elected in 98, with oil prices just soaring, he took that idea to a whole new level. And this was the ideology that fueled everything: resource nationalism. The core belief is actually pretty simple. A nation's wealth, its oil, its minerals, it should belong to its people, not to foreign corporations. And that was an incredibly powerful message he used to justify the state taking control of all these key parts of the economy. So that ideology led directly to this huge wave of nationalizations. But it's really important to understand that it wasn't just one big event. It happened in two very different phases, under two very different leaders. And this chart just lays out that difference perfectly. Under Chávez, the takeovers felt strategic, planned. He was targeting the big key industries, oil, telecom, and sometimes he even negotiated buyouts. But under his successor, Nicolás Maduro, things were different. As the economy fell apart, the takeovers became reactive, almost chaotic. Often, they were just seizing factories that U.S. companies had already shut down and left behind. Back in the Chávez era, the targets were massive. The biggest showdown, for sure, was the 2007 seizure of the Orinoco Belt oil projects from giants like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. But what's interesting is that other takeovers, like when they took over Verizon's share of the phone company or AES Corp's utility, were actually negotiated deals. Now, fast forward to the Maduro era, and it's a completely different story. The economic crisis was in full swing, and U.S. companies like Clorox, Kimberly-Clark, and GM were shutting down their plants. Why? Because they couldn't get raw materials, they couldn't get currency. The government's response? Seized the empty factories and accused the companies of sabotage. And with Kellogg's, they even kept making cereal and using the brand names, which they had no right to do. So what happened after all of this? Did taking over all these industries bring prosperity to Venezuela? Well, the numbers, they tell a pretty clear and pretty devastating story. You don't have to look any further than the oil industry itself. After the state took over, they replaced thousands of skilled engineers with political loyalists and just stopped investing in the infrastructure. The result? Production absolutely cratered. It went from a healthy 3.5 million barrels a day down to just 400,000 by 2020. For a country that depends on oil, that is a catastrophic collapse. And it wasn't just oil. Remember those factories they seized? Well, taking them over didn't fix the shortages of things like toilet paper and cleaning supplies. It actually made them way worse. Without the capital, the materials, or the know-how, these state-run plants were operating at maybe 20% of what they used to, if they were running at all. It just deepened the whole crisis. So this all brings us to a potential twist. Something that could happen in the near future that might just bring this entire crazy saga full circle. According to the source material, there's a scenario being looked at for early 2026 that could see a stunning reversal. The idea is that a new government could emerge in Venezuela, and the US administration would then announce plans to effectively take operational control of the oil industry. The justification? That it's the only way to recover the huge losses for American firms and rebuild the very industry US companies helped create in the first place. Now, through all this chaos, for 2 decades, one American oil giant played the game totally differently, Chevron. They managed to stick around by negotiating and accepting tougher conditions from the government. They never left, and that unique strategy puts them in a prime position to be a major winner if and when Venezuela's oil sector ever fully reopens to US investment. So think about where this has all led. A policy of taking back national resources led to the seizure of billions in US assets. That, in turn, led to an economic collapse and the loss of Venezuela's most valuable foreign company. And now it could all end with US control over those very same resources. Which really leaves us with one big question. After 2 decades of this back and forth, has this historical cycle of seizure and recovery finally run its course?
Get